What do you want to read through if you're doing a spot revision for an inspector course and you've got an exam in the near future? It's the inspector's last speech, of course, and I'm going to show you why you want to include something from this speech in whatever essay you're going to write. Firstly, this speech is not addressed to the characters on stage, but is instead intended to direct the members of the audience, and in particular, the audience watching it after World War II. Characters are constructs, they're made up, and they can't change anything about the world in which we live. We, however, can change what happens in the future, and that is why Priestley wants to influence us. So let's turn our attention to the speech and see what he says. There's a lot here. You can't quote this much, but you can quote that there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. It's easy to learn. Get it on a flashcard, then say the most obvious method that's being used, repetition. Millions is a lot. It's a big number. But he repeats it again and again to emphasise how many working class people there are. Do you know what there aren't a lot of? Burlings and Crofts. That's power in a democracy. Priestley is pointing out that a new Britain can be built in 1946, and it can be voted for, and it can be socially responsible. The power of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, has extended to all those millions, but it doesn't have to. The play isn't about Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. She was just a symbol for the working class. So Priestley shifts the focus to Eva Smith's and John Smith's. This isn't about a young lady being exploited. This is about the exploitation of a whole class of people, the biggest class of people, the majority of the people being exploited by a few in lots of different ways. But there is hope. Priestley says these people, millions and millions and millions, are still with us. The plural pronoun us, emphasising the inclusivity, siding the audience with Priestley and away from the repulsive Burlings. Priestley uses a series of tricolons next. Tricolons are three grammatically linked or similar or parallel phrases. When the inspector says their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, the three parts are linked because they all refer back to their. You can also call this a triple or a rule of three. If your teachers taught you that word, carry on using it. You can also look at the antithesis held within the phrases, like the abstract nouns hopes and fears. The use of opposites comprises the breadth and depth of these imagined millions, and the final element of the tricolon reverses that order of antithesis from positive, then positive, allowing Priestley to acknowledge the suffering of the working class, but also end the tricolon with the positive abstraction of happiness. An ascending tricolon is when each part is increasing in length or importance, and I think that applies here. Happiness is the key element, and what Priestley is building to. Let's link this back to Eva Smith and secure our analysis in the text, and say that this part of the speech tells the audience that the suffering should be over, that the suffering should be over for Eva Smith and people like her, and they must go out and they provide happiness for themselves and the other people around them and take responsibility for ensuring that those people are happy in their lives. In the interest of brevity, I'll gloss over the tricolon of how all our lives are intertwined by what we think and say and do, but you might like to develop that analysis yourself. Priestley uses three short, simple sentences to follow. Short sentences are interesting, and when you spot them, you can usually say that they control the pace and slow things down to allow the reader or audience to think. In this case, the words of the inspector are slowed down by Priestley. The actor is forced to pause at the full stop, and the audience is forced to listen. This heightens the moment of the inspector's exit and, therefore, his final message. The simple first sentence is a negative. We don't live alone. If you're wondering how to comment on that, think about how the sentence ends. and therefore pauses on alone. Eva Smith has just died alone. So that's a great moment of pathos and depth from Priestley. That tiny dot, the full stop, allows us the moment of commiseration that Arthur Burling and Sybil Burling will never give to Eva Smith. The inclusive pronoun we brings us back together, if not for Eva, then for the future. We are members of one body. The inclusive pronoun we is repeated, and it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. I've heard people talk about the togetherness of this, and that's the essence, the idea that we're all connected, and he's pointing out the obvious, that the human race are all the same species, the same body, and belong together, not divided. The next point can be slightly tricky to articulate, so feel free to skip 10 seconds, 20 seconds, if you don't want to push the thinking beyond GCSE. Priestley is really appealing to a different audience with this, so trying to bridge two often opposing audiences. He's using the language of the Bible. Corinthians 12:12 says, "For as the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ." Priestley was not a Christian. He was a socialist. But he recognized that many people were Christians, and he recognized that in some ways the teaching of Christ do align with socialism. The three parallel short sentences end with, "We are responsible for each other." This is the conclusion. This is the weighty conclusion. The pause at the end of that sentence has to be impressive. Priestley wants us to walk out of the theatre thinking this very thing. Think about what else you can say. Each other is also inclusive. We have all got value. We all have input, and we're all to blame if it goes wrong. We don't want that on our conscience. The final tricolon that Priestley uses gives us a warning. If men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. The pronouns have shifted to they, not us. We will learn. Those others may not, but not us. I'm going to argue that this tricolon is ascending, getting greater in value as it moves from the outside to the inside. Fire is scary, but it's outside of me. Blood is nearer me as the subject, but anguish is internal. The pain is greater than blood or fire. The pain is shifting from the physical to the mental, from the ordinary world out there to the essence of what it means to be human. When the play was first performed in the UK in 1946, the fire and blood and anguish would be recent news. The word Holocaust means everything is burnt, that the whole world has been destroyed. This could be a reference to this. If we fail to take responsibility for each other, we end up with a Holocaust. We end up with a world war killing around 75 million people. A 1946 audience in London know that. The war ended last year for them, and they would miss those people in such a personal way that's hard for us to contemplate. Priestley, it always has to come back to the writer and the text, by the way. Priestley wants the audience to rebuild the world in a way that prevents this happening again. That means rebuilding without people like the Burlings or the Crofts. In a way, Priestley is saying, if we could turn back the clock to 1912, recognise these fools in charge for what they are, we might be in a better place. We can't do that, but we can start to make it better now. And that's the point. Whenever we might have seen the play, Priestley wants us to leave the theatre and make the world a fairer place.